Donald Trump has been President of the United States for 1 week. What have we learned? Is President Trump any different from candidate Trump? And what might these first days in office tell us about the years to come? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Week one for Donald Trump, and he's wasted no time in making his mark as the 45th President of the United States. In the first 7 days, he set out to repeal the healthcare law known as Obamacare. He has pulled out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal and cleared the way for the construction of two controversial pipelines. And he's told Mexico the wall will be built and Mexico will pay for it. President Trump has clearly signaled his priorities for the year ahead, with foreign policies that no longer look outward but inward.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. America first.
Radical Islamic terrorism, and I said it yesterday, has to be eradicated just off the face of the earth. A nation without borders is not a nation.
We're going to have extreme vetting for people coming into our country, and if we think there's a problem, it's not going to be so easy for people to come in anymore.
The Secretary of Homeland Security, working with myself and my staff, will begin immediate construction of a border wall.
We are fighting sneaky rats right now that are sick and demented, and we're going to win.
Requires other countries to take back their criminals. They will take them back.
To be clear, all of those clips were from the last week. Let's take a closer look at the Trump administration's foreign policy so far. On Wednesday, the new U.S. president signed executive orders on immigration and border security. These will make it easier for the government to detain and deport illegal immigrants and strip federal money from so-called sanctuary cities where local governments protect undocumented immigrants. Draft orders that were leaked to the media would freeze the U.S. refugee program and bar Syrians from it completely. They also prevent anyone holding a passport from certain Muslim-majority countries from traveling to the United States. It should be emphasized those orders are drafts and Trump has not signed them yet. Fulfilling one of his main campaign promises, Trump has ordered for the construction of a wall along the border with Mexico. He insists Mexico will pay for it, though it's unclear how that would actually work. That led Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto canceling a trip to Washington. Who will be heading Trump's national security and foreign policy team? Defense Secretary James Mattis, Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly and CIA Director Mike Pompeo have all been sworn in. Nikki Haley is now the ambassador to the United Nations. Rex Tillerson's nomination as Secretary of State has been advanced, meaning he'll now get a vote by the full Senate. And Michael Flynn is Trump's pick for National Security Advisor. That post does not require Senate confirmation. It's a busy week ahead for the US President meeting foreign leaders. On Friday, he hosts British Prime Minister Theresa May at the White House. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he's looking forward to meeting soon. And Russian President Vladimir Putin is expected to speak with Trump over the phone on Saturday. Let's bring in our guests in Bloomington. David Bosco, Associate Professor of International Politics at Indiana University. In New York, Eric Levitz, Associate Editor at New York Magazine's Daily Intelligencer, and in Washington, Charles King Mallory, Senior Researcher at the Rand Corporation's Boston office and a former State Department official under President George W. Bush. He also served as a foreign policy advisor to Ohio Governor John Kasich during last year's Republican presidential primaries. Let me start by asking Mr. David Bosco, over the last few days, I think Trump confounded the media and some Americans by his offhand remarks about different issues. Iraq's oil, inauguration, crowd sizes, many, many issues. Is this someone who is trying to adjust by every passing day? Or do you think this is someone who is reinventing the presidency?
Well, I think he's making a real push to try to turn his campaign rhetoric into reality. But he's doing so, but he's also combining that with his penchant for kind of off-the-cuff remarks, provocative statements that we saw throughout the campaign. And so you get this kind of bewildering and dizzying array of statements that have left the U.S. foreign policy establishment and the U.S. political establishment just kind of bewildered. And I think the media is trying to also figure out how to deal with this. There's obviously been a lot of tension with the media. But on foreign policy terms, you know, he's talking about the wall with Mexico, which was obviously a staple of his campaign rhetoric. He's talking about withdrawing from multilateral institutions, or at least dialing back U.S. participation. He's talking about how the major trade deals and trade organizations that the U.S. is part of are not a good deal for the United States. So all of that is pretty much consistent with what he said during the campaign. So yes, there's a lot of kind of off-the-cuff stuff that is also generating headlines, but there is a core here that really reflects what he said during the campaign.
Let me go to Mr. Eric Levitz. Mr. Eric, President Trump has withdrawn from the Trans-Pacific Partnership trade deal. As we all know, bilateral trade deals are basic tenets of foreign policy. Is he just trying to project the image of someone who is saying, I am determined to honor the promises that I made in the past?
Yeah, I think that's part of his goal. I mean, I think the Trans-Pacific Partnership was kind of dead at this point anyway. The presidential campaign, by the end of it, you had both major party candidates coming out against it, and a lot of their major primary opponents against it. Congress was not interested in the TPP anymore. For the right, it was too heavily associated with Barack Obama. For the left, Labor was too against it. So that wasn't, I don't think, the most significant action that he took. But yeah, he's doing these series of, he's signing these series of really hastily written executive orders that were drafted by, the former mastermind behind the fringe website Breitbart and almost no one else. These were not vetted by legal counsel or by the relevant cabinet agencies. And so it's kind of almost an extension of he's done these events where he has announced that he has brought back all these jobs. He's reframed corporations' expansion plans that were drafted before his election as a product of his election, and done these sort of theatrical examples showing himself as a leader. And in a certain sense, some of these executive orders are theatrical productions. When he signs a leather-bound document that says we're building the wall, that doesn't actually build the wall without a congressional appropriation. And similarly, his action on defunding sanctuary cities, there's strong arguments that the federalism built into our system does not allow him to do that. It's possible there's arguments on the other side, but it's a highly contentious legal issue. And from what we've seen from reporting, he hasn't consulted any lawyers on these things.
Mr. Charles Mallory, now the Americans and the Mexicans face the biggest diplomatic crisis in many, many years. Do you believe this is something that could further escalate, or that the issue of the border wall could be ultimately contained?
I do think that ultimately the business community will make its voice heard. The reason is that there are supply chains that span across the border that are very complicated, where goods cross the border 4 or 5 times. And if this conflict continues, there's going to be massive disruption to major sections of U.S. manufacturing industry. And that disruption will have impacts on jobs. And so sooner or later, I expect there to be some equilibration. And ultimately, Mexico is our neighbor and is not moving.
Mr. David Bosco, the White House press secretary said that the Mexicans would ultimately pay for the border wall. And if that didn't happen, then the Americans would impose 20% taxes on imports from Mexico. This is a total revamp of the whole tax code strategy that has been, or orthodoxy that has been going on for quite some time in the United States of America.
Yeah, and that was also, though, an indication, just as I think Eric was pointing out, about how hastily a lot of this is being pushed out, because as I understand it, the White House spokesperson talked about this 20% tax on imports from Mexico, but then they fairly quickly backed down on that. And I think the view of many economists is that if you impose a 20% tax like that, essentially it's going to be American consumers who are going to pay for it. And that leaves aside the issue of whether Mexico retaliates and then how that hurts American exporters. And Mexico is a very large export market for the United States. And so, as was indicated by some of your other guests, I think we're going to see the business community starting to really push back hard on some of this and the instability and uncertainty that it's generating for exporters and other businesses that are in the import-export world. And those voices, those business voices, have a lot of sway in politics, obviously, but particularly with the Republican Party, and you would think with President Trump. And so I think a lot of this is going to end up being walked back or at least moderated significantly. But I think Trump is, he's giving this appearance of frenetic action. I think with the idea of telling folks who supported him that I'm moving things forward, and he certainly is shaking things up in a way that few presidents have.
Mr. Eric, do you believe, as Mr. Bosco is basically saying that ultimately Trump will have to take into account that political life is a much more complex reality, and that therefore he will have to cave in to be able to do business with countries? China would be a much robust country than Mexico.
Yeah, I think it's I think it's an open question right now. I mean, I think we're in a really strange moment. I think that, for one thing, though, on the 20% tax, it now appears from the latest reporting that I've seen that Spicer, the White House press secretary, was just very clumsily describing the House GOP's overall tax plan, which includes this thing called border adjustment, which is a change to the corporate tax that kind of functions a little bit like a VAT. Anyway, we stop taxing the profits of our exporters overseas, and we start taxing their imports, their inputs that they import, at 20%, which would be the new overall corporate rate. It's complicated, but it's slightly less extreme and protectionist than what Spicer made it sound like. But anyhow, I do think that there is some question. You have this draft order floating around where Trump is threatening to defund, essentially defund the United Nations, to cut U.S. support for the UN by at least 40%. And that's a move. I don't know. But it seems like there are a lot of people within the Trump administration that have a diluted understanding of America's relationship to other countries, and have this idea that the UN, which the U.S. set up in large part to promote its own interests, is somehow an enemy of us. And I think that, at least in his early actions, he is moving in a direction where there's going to be this vacuum that China could very well fill.
Let's go to the...
I'm not sure they have an accurate perception of how powerful the U.S. is right now.
I see your point. Let's move to the other draft executive orders that have not yet been signed by Trump, particularly the ones on the restrictions on immigration and refugees. Mr. Mallory, the general sentiment in this part of the world when they first heard about the draft documents is that basically it's going to be a very tough time ahead for Muslims who live in America, and also for Muslims in the Middle East in their relationship with America.
Well, I think one needs to take a slightly more nuanced approach. I mean, if you look at the countries that have been targeted by this action, places like Iraq, Iran, Syria, Yemen, it's notable the places that haven't been targeted, places like Egypt, places like Morocco, places like Algeria. So I don't think it is as broad a brush as some people had feared during the election campaign. I think there is a legitimate cause for concern because these are conflict regions. But certainly people from that part of the world, or people who have traveled to that part of the world, life is not going to be very simple at the border going forward.
Mr. Eric, the counter argument is that instead of blacklisting countries, it's in the interest of the United States of America to engage with those countries to be able to tackle the challenges it will face in the near future.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's generally correct. I believe, I haven't checked this, but I saw something that, the countries on this list, no foreign national from those countries have executed a significant terrorist attack on the United States ever in the past. So I don't know that it is the most rational way of combating this problem. And you have, it's a tired argument at this point, but I think it's a true one, that in many ways Trump is doing the work of Islamic extremists for them, having the U.S. president show himself to be totally callous in his attitude towards refugees who've been displaced by war, and vilifying Muslims in his rhetoric is a way of framing this conflict on their terms, that it is the West versus Islam rather than the West versus these fringe fanatic groups.
Mr. Charles, isn't this something that would further strain ties between the United States of America and the EU, particularly, I mean, if you look at some of the provisions of the draft executive orders, there would be a freeze on the resettlement of Syrian refugees into the United States of America. But then what would the Europeans say, who have had to shoulder most of the burden themselves?
Just to quickly pick up on something that Mr. Levitz said before responding to your question, Hashem.
Yeah,
I do think that it's fairly clear that there have been incidents of terrorism coming from Iran and from Syria and from Iraq directed at the United States. So I don't think that's quite accurate. Certainly it's not going to be helpful when it comes to the issue of the Syrian refugees. I think that the thing that gave a lot of people pause for thought was during the campaign when Director Comey of the FBI and Director Clapper of the Director of National Intelligence came out and said, we have no way of really vetting these people properly. We had been pushing actually to accept a larger number of refugees as a matter of moral responsibility. But when two of the chiefs of your security services say they have no way of really vetting these people properly, I think it gives anyone pause.
Eric, would you like to say anything about the comment made by Mr. Mallory?
I don't consider myself authoritative on that. I would just say that what I had heard is, on U.S. soil, I am certainly aware that there have been attacks, by Iran against American soldiers overseas. But I don't know. From my understanding, and it's entirely possible that he has a better command of this subject, that we have a pretty rigorous vetting process for refugees in the United States, and we have not had a significant problem with refugee violence. And so I think if you weigh the pros and cons, the risks that these are regions of the world where Islamic extremism does have a foothold, that is a risk if we take in people from there. But if you weigh it against the instability that's caused by the refugee crisis for our allies overseas and for our perception in the world, from where I'm sitting, you add in the humanitarian element, and it's not a difficult choice.
Let me go to another subject here.
Hashem, can I come in on that? point?
Please, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think we also need to keep in mind that, what President Obama had in place in terms of Syrian refugees, was a very small number. And so if we're talking about really dealing with the Syrian refugee crisis, the United States is a marginal player and has been a marginal player in terms of dealing with the vast numbers of refugees that have been produced. So I don't think we should be under any illusion that either President Obama's policy or President Trump's policy is going to make a huge amount of difference in terms of dealing with that vast problem. But I do think there's an important image aspect. There's an important question of kind of ethical responsibility and signaling to the world what the United States is about. I think that's very real. I think in terms of dealing with the Syrian problem, the United States refugee policy is somewhat marginal.
However, Mr. Bosco, I want to ask you this question, but at the same time, the draft executive order says that Trump is going to push for safe areas in Syria. Is this an indication that the Americans are going to play an aggressive role in the Syrian conflict in the near future?
Well, this is a big question. I was going to say, I think this is probably more important in terms of the Syria problem itself. And this idea of safe areas has been floating around for quite a long time. But one of the interesting phenomena here is that there seems to have been very little consultation with the Russians about this, and obviously consultation with the Russians, given their role there, is quite important. And so there were some comments from Moscow suggesting that this plan hadn't really been discussed. So I think it will be quite interesting to see what Trump does in terms of actual policy towards the situation in Syria on the ground, because he's certainly there's obviously been a lot of good signaling and friendly signaling toward Russia and vice versa. But when it turned to concrete policy questions about what do you do in Syria, there is where you could start to see some of that good relations fray a bit. And I think we saw a hint of that this past week.
Mr. Mallory, dealing with the Middle East means that the Americans have to engage with key players, regional players, the Russia and international players, like the Russians, the Iranians, and the Saudis. I would like to ask you this question about Iran. Do you believe that we might see further strained ties between the Americans and the Iranians in the near future?
Well, I think that there are indications that the National Security Advisor, General Flynn, belongs to a more skeptical school when it comes to the Iranian deal, and to Iran generally. So that would certainly speak for potential deeper strains in the relationship. I would note that it appears that Iran is abiding by the terms of the deal. There is an opportunity here with the impending fall of Mosul and with the conquest of Aleppo for the Iranian and Russian sides to take an initiative diplomatically and try and come to a political solution to this problem. And my concern for the United States would be that we are sort of out of the picture and marginalized, not at the table in what could end up being a series of negotiations that reshape the modern Middle East.
Mm-hmm. I have this question for both Eric and Bosco. Former President Obama recently said that once in office, Trump will get the wake-up call and adjust as US president. Do you think now, dealing with international politics, he will definitely have to take into account that are different centers of power and that therefore he will have to make more concessions to be able to move on?
Well, I think the idea that the office is going to, sober Mr. Trump and really change him fundamentally from the man that we knew during the campaign has been decisively put to rest over the past week. I think that what we have to understand, which has been reiterated by Trump himself many times, is this is a man who does not like to read documents that are more than a couple pages long, watches cable news all day, and has sort of an insatiable appetite for attention and affirmation of his ego. So I don't know that Trump is going to respond rationally to inputs from foreign actors. Whether the people around him will and will instruct him to change tactics is a different question, but I wouldn't put much stock in Trump himself being humbled by the international situation.
Let's hear from Mr. Bosco.
Yeah, I tend to agree with Eric in that. I mean, we've had these moments throughout Trump's political rise where people have said, well, when he gets the nomination, he'll change. When he's the president-elect, he'll change. And at each point, he really hasn't changed. But I think what's more interesting and what seems to be emerging is that I think we could have a real divergence, in a sense, between Trump himself and his administration. And you've already started to see that, where essentially General or Secretary Mattis is talking to people and more or less saying, don't listen to Trump on these issues. And you've had Nikki Haley, the UN ambassador, separating herself from Trump. And so we're starting to get hints of what could be a really bizarre and kind of unprecedented situation where we have an administration kind of going about its business and a kind of flamboyant, blustering president who is only marginally related to the actual levers of policy control. And so that seems to me more likely than Trump himself changing and becoming more moderate and more grounded in political realities.
Gentlemen, we'll definitely have an opportunity in the near future to talk more about Trump's policy. David Bosco, Eric Levitz, and Charles Mallory, thank you very much indeed for your time. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem, Ahelbarra, and the whole team here. Bye for now.